The heavy, rhythmic hiss of a mechanical ventilator was the first sound that managed to breach the thick, suffocating darkness of my unconscious mind. It was a cold, clinical noise, a sterile breath that felt entirely detached from the biological reality of my own failing body. When my eyelids finally flickered open, the blinding, fluorescent glare of a Portland intensive care unit struck my eyes with the force of a physical blow. The world was a blurred, disorienting tapestry of white walls, flashing green monitors, and the faint, acrid scent of harsh medical antiseptics. My throat was entirely raw, burned by the plastic architecture of a breathing tube that had only recently been removed from my airway. Every muscle in my body throbbed with a dull, unyielding agony, a brutal physical testament to the catastrophic car accident that had nearly claimed my life on a rain-slicked highway 17 days prior. Sitting in the vinyl armchair beside my mattress was my husband, Derek, his face lined with the deep, exhausting shadows of a man who had forgotten the concept of sleep. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, a wave of profound, breathless relief washed over his features, and he violently reached forward to grip my weak hand. "You're back, Rebecca," Derek whispered, his voice cracking into a ragged, emotional sob as he pressed his forehead against my cold knuckles. "The doctors told me to prepare for the absolute worst, but you survived." I tried to speak, but my vocal cords could only produce a faint, raspy click in the back of my throat, my mind still struggling to process the massive gap in my timeline. Derek gently held a cup of water with a straw to my lips, allowing the cool liquid to soothe the internal burns of my throat before he sat back down, his expression suddenly darkening into a grim, terrifying solemnity. As the neurological fog slowly began to dissipate from my brain, I noticed a thick, blue legal folder resting on the overbed table, its cover stamped with high-priority medical compliance seals. What is that, Derek?" I finally managed to gasp, my voice sounding incredibly small and fragile in the quiet room. Derek looked at the folder, his jaw tightly clenching as a dangerous, white-hot anger began to flash deep within his eyes. "This is the official medical administration record from the night you were brought into the trauma bay, Rebecca," Derek said, his voice dropping into a low, chilling whisper. "While you were slipping into a deep coma, the neurosurgeons encountered a severe intracranial pressure spike that required immediate, emergency intervention. They needed an immediate, formal signature from your primary biological guardian to authorize the advanced life support protocols while I was still speeding across state lines to get to the hospital. Your father, Donald, was the only family member present in the building when the critical emergency alerts were broadcast by the trauma staff." Derek opened the folder, flipping past rows of complex clinical charts until he stopped at a stark, white document containing a signature block at the bottom of the page. I looked down at the paper, and a sudden, paralyzing wave of pure ice rushed through my veins, completely freezing the air inside my lungs. It was an official, emergency do not resuscitate order, a legal directive commanding the medical staff to cease all advanced life support measures if my heart rate fluctuated. And resting on the signature line, executed with a sharp, arrogant flourish that I had recognized since my childhood, was the name of my biological father, Donald Miller. He hadn't signed to authorize my survival. He had signed a legal command to let me die on that operating table while my husband was still frantically trying to reach my side. When the doctors confronted him about the choice, claiming that the advanced life support machinery was your only chance of survival, Donald told them that the family simply lacked the long-term funds to maintain a vegetable, Derek explained, his voice trembling with a righteous, protective fury. "He actively tried to pull the plug on your life, Rebecca, and the only reason you are breathing today is because the attending chief of surgery used an emergency legal bypass to keep the machines running until I arrived to override Donald's authority." I sat back against the stiff hospital pillows, staring at the ceiling as the absolute, crushing weight of his betrayal hollowed out the final remnants of my childhood memories. To understand how a biological father could look at his own daughter dying in a trauma bay and choose to sign her death warrant, you have to understand the toxic hierarchy of the Miller family. For over a decade, Donald Miller had been a man consumed by an insatiable need for social status and corporate prestige, running a mid-sized logistical consultancy firm that was permanently on the verge of structural collapse. He was a proud, narcissistic patriarch who viewed his children not as individuals to be protected, but as instruments to fund his unearned vanity and project an illusion of extreme wealth to his country club peers. When my maternal grandmother passed away 3 years prior, she had bypassed Donald entirely, leaving a $250,000 artistic and educational inheritance trust strictly designated for my future independent design studio. Donald had been named the primary administrative trustee of the portfolio due to a legacy loophole in the family's historical legal structures, a position he accepted with a smug, patronizing smile. Whenever I asked for a formal accounting of the trust assets so I could begin scouting commercial properties for my business, Donald would wave his hand dismissively, claiming that the market was too volatile and that I lacked the maturity to manage real capital. He branded me as an ungrateful, hypersensitive dreamer who didn't understand the realities of high finance, using his voice as a weapon to keep me compliant and dependent on his mood. But as I stared at that emergency DNR order in the quiet hospital room, my background as a corporate compliance auditor instantly overrode the emotional grief, hardening my thoughts into a cold, forensic focus. A simple lack of medical funds didn't make a proud, narcissistic billionaire patriarch sign an immediate death warrant for his eldest child within 30 minutes of a car crash. Donald loved his public image far too much to ever face the social stigma of letting his daughter die over a hospital bill, unless my survival represented an absolute, existential threat to his freedom. "Derek, I need you to bring my secure corporate laptop from our apartment immediately," I said, my voice smooth, chillingly calm and entirely level as the survival instincts took complete control of my mind. "We need to open the legacy banking portals for the Grandmother Trust, and we need to do it before my father realizes I have opened my eyes." Within 2 hours, Derek returned with the encrypted device, and together, from the sterile confines of my ICU bed, we launched a relentless, subterranean digital audit of the inheritance portfolio. As the complex transaction histories and hidden subledgers fully decrypted onto the screen before my eyes, the massive, dark plot twist laid itself bare with absolute, mathematical certainty. The $250,000 inheritance trust left to me by my grandmother was completely gone, siphoned out of the secure accounts over a 36-month timeline. Donald had quietly established a fraudulent, multi-layered investment shell company under his own consultancy firm, using his trustee powers to execute massive, unauthorized capital transfers. He had used my inheritance to pay off his company's mounting debts, cover the high-interest margins on his luxury personal vehicles, and fund an extravagant lifestyle of artificial wealth to fool his corporate partners. The ledger revealed that the shell company had completely collapsed into a definitive default weeks before my car accident, leaving a terrifying paper trail that would trigger an automatic federal audit the moment I turned 30 and legally assumed sole control of the portfolio. The chilling, sickening truth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Donald didn't sign that emergency DNR order out of a tragic concern for medical costs. He signed that document because my sudden, catastrophic car accident represented the perfect, unpunishable solution to his criminal exposure. If I died on that operating table under a legal DNR order, the inheritance trust would automatically dissolve. The assets would permanently merge into his primary estate, and the fraudulent paper trail would be buried in the graveyard forever. He had actively attempted to execute his own daughter's medical termination to protect himself from a federal prison sentence for grand larceny and estate fraud. The absolute depravity of his choice burned away the final shred of my hesitation, replacing my physical weakness with an icy, calculated desire for absolute retribution. He truly believed that my typical quiet nature and fear of family conflict would allow him to ride this wave of destruction to a clean escape. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed a professional auditor the weapon for his own destruction. "Derek, call our corporate estate attorneys and tell them to prepare an emergency ex parte petition for a total revocation of trustee powers," I commanded, my eyes locking onto the flashing green lines of the cardiac monitor. We have exactly 48 hours to strip my father of every ounce of authority he possesses, and I am going to ensure he never sees the light of safety again. The high-stakes legal alliance between myself and Derek transformed the hospital room into a cold, mechanical command center over the next 2 days. We worked through the night, compiling the encrypted wire transfers, the forged trustee disclosure forms, and the certified medical records showing the exact timeline of Donald's DNR signature. By Friday morning, my legal team had secured an emergency, closed-door hearing with a senior state probate judge, presenting the unassailable forensic paper trail of the $250,000 theft. The judge was completely mortified by the sheer clinical cruelty of the documentation, instantly signing an emergency order that stripped Donald Miller of his trustee powers and froze his personal and corporate asset portfolios. With the legal injunction secured, it was time to execute the physical confrontation and force my father into the corner he had spent 30 years avoiding. I refused to sit in the hospital and hide. Against the frantic advice of the nursing staff, I discharged myself from the unit, my broken ribs tightly bound in medical tape as I walked out of the building supported by Derek's strong arm. We drove directly to the corporate headquarters of Miller Logistical Consultancy in downtown Portland, stepping into the glass-walled executive boardroom at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Donald was sitting at the head of the mahogany table, laughing loudly with 2 potential investors as he signed a series of promotional corporate brochures. The moment the heavy double doors swung open and he spotted me standing there, his face instantly turned a grotesque, pale shade of ash, the promotional pen slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the wood. "Rebecca, what are you doing here?" Donald stammered, his voice instantly dropping into a weak, unstable pitch as he tried to maintain his mask of smooth paternal authority. "You belong in an ICU bed. You are completely unhinged to be walking around in this state." "Gentlemen, please excuse us. This is a private family matter," he added, turning to his investors with a frantic, sweating smile. The investors didn't move because Derek had already stepped into the room, closing the door firmly behind him and placing a stack of certified federal legal summonses directly onto the center of the table. "The investors can stay, Donald, because their capital is currently being used to fund an active criminal enterprise," I said, my voice smooth, completely calm, and carrying an icy resonance that silenced the entire room. I slid the heavy blue medical folder and the forensic accounting ledger across the polished mahogany, the papers stopping directly in front of his trembling hands. "You have exactly 60 seconds to read the emergency court order stripping you of your trustee powers and freezing your corporate assets," I stated, looking him dead in the eyes. "You spent 30 years treating my life like a disposable asset for your pride, and less than 48 hours ago, you signed a piece of paper commanding the doctors to let me die to hide your $250,000 theft." Donald's jaw violently trembled, his eyes bulging with a sudden, suffocating panic as he looked at the forensic hashes showing his private shell company routing numbers. "This is a complete fabrication. I signed that medical order to protect you from a life of vegetative misery, Rebecca. I am your father, I raised you," he roared, his voice cracking under the sudden weight of his exposure. "You didn't sign to save me, Donald. You signed to save yourself from a federal fraud indictment, and your 60 seconds are officially over," I replied, stepping back toward the door. The investors look at my father with expressions of pure, unadulterated loathing, instantly gathering their briefcases and walking out of the boardroom, effectively canceling a $3 million capital injection that his firm desperately needed to survive the month. Donald dropped heavily into his executive leather chair, his hands flying to his face as the reality of his total financial lockdown began to crash into his consciousness. He believed that the legal loss of the asset portfolio was the absolute peak of my revenge. He had absolutely no idea that the legal boardroom confrontation was simply the opening salvo of a viral nationwide execution. I refused to let his crimes be settled behind the quiet, polite curtains of a private probate court or buried in confidential legal settlements. The moment we returned to our vehicle, I reached into my bag and pulled out a secondary secure drive containing the complete, unedited digital record of the medical betrayal and the financial fraud. I had already established a secure line of communication with Victoria Vance, a prominent, award-winning investigative journalist for a major national news network specializing in white-collar corruption and medical ethics violations. I met Victoria in a quiet studio apartment downtown, handing her the complete, certified paper trail on a silver platter, the 4K video scans of the forged trust documents, the toxicological reports, and the unyielding signature on the DNR order. "This isn't just a local fraud story, Rebecca," Victoria said, her eyes flashing with an intense professional determination as she scanned the clinical charts. "This is a terrifying case of a parent weaponizing a medical emergency to execute an economic homicide. We are breaking this story on the national primetime broadcast tonight," she added, closing her laptop with a heavy, definitive snap. At 8 o'clock that evening, while Donald was sitting alone in his dark office trying to find a corrupt banking contact to bypass the asset freeze, the national news broadcast aired. The segment was a magnificent, brutal deployment of investigative journalism, with my father's face filling millions of television screens across the country under a stark, crimson banner that read, "The DNR Fraud, a Father's Deadly Greed." Victoria Vance laid out the entire mathematical timeline with an absolute, unyielding clarity, playing the recorded statements of the hospital's chief of surgery and displaying the forged trust documents side by side. The explosive public karma sequence went viral across every major digital platform within less than 3 hours, racking up millions of shares and triggering a massive wave of nationwide outrage. The complete collapse of Donald Miller's life descended upon his household over the next 72 hours with the unstoppable, crushing velocity of a natural law. By Saturday morning, the front gates of his suburban mansion were completely blocked by a wall of local and national news cameras, their bright lenses capturing his every movement through the windows. The local country club, where he had spent decades preening in front of his wealthy peers, issued an immediate, public revocation of his membership, branding him a social outcast who was explicitly banned from entering the property. His remaining corporate clients tore up their consultancy contracts within minutes of the broadcast, desperate to distance their brands from the toxic stench of a man who had tried to let his own daughter die for currency. The state prosecutor's office, driven by the massive public outcry and the flawless forensic evidence, immediately launched a formal, multi-layered criminal investigation into grand larceny, identity forgery, and attempted medical fraud. Donald was forced to sit in his empty office, watching his pristine social status and his entire life's work dissolve into pure, unadulterated scorn because of the very greed he had nurtured. He tried to launch a final, desperate counterattack, using a burner phone to bomb my secure lines with dozens of frantic, weeping voicemails in the dead of the night. "Rebecca, please, your own father is begging you on his knees." Donald's voice sobbed through the speaker, his tone completely stripped of the booming, arrogant authority he used to terrorize me with. "The bank has officially foreclosed on the mansion. My firm is completely bankrupt, and the federal investigators are telling my lawyers that I am facing 15 years in a penitentiary. We are family, Rebecca. Blood is supposed to be thicker than a financial account. I made a terrible mistake under immense corporate pressure, but you cannot let your own father rot in a state cell. Please call the news network and tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. I will give you back every single dollar of the grandmother trust once the market recovers. I swear on my life." I sat on the plush sofa of my new, sun-filled design studio, a beautiful sanctuary with large glass windows that looked out over the rolling currents of the Willamette River. The space around us was filled with the soft, comforting aroma of fresh coffee, beautiful art prints, and the absolute, unshakable safety of a life that had been fully reclaimed. I listened to his frantic, pathetic cries with an entirely level heart rate, a soft, calm smile spreading across my lips as the words faded into the digital logging system. I didn't feel a single flash of malicious joy, and I didn't waste a single second writing long, defensive paragraphs trying to make a narcissist understand the depth of his cruelty. True liberation means reaching a psychological place where the burning panic of your abusers carries exactly zero weight over your self-worth. Their sudden, Frantic appeals to family loyalty weren't born out of a genuine realization of the pain they had inflicted upon me during my childhood. They were born out of a primitive, desperate terror over the loss of their unearned status. He didn't miss his daughter. He missed the quiet compliance and the defenseless target that had allowed him to commit financial crimes without ever facing a consequence. I deleted the voicemail file with a single, gentle tap of my finger, letting his words dissolve into the digital void, leaving my beautiful studio in absolute, permanent serenity. The destruction of his life hadn't been caused by my cold revenge. It was simply the natural, mathematical harvest of the bitter, greedy seeds he had planted over a lifetime of exploitation. He had tried to steal my future to protect his unearned control, and he was finally being forced to live in the silent, empty desert of his own creation. As I look out over the river this evening, Derek's hand gently sliding into mine as the sunset paints the sky in vibrant shades of gold and deep violet, a profound sense of total victory settles into my soul. I survived the catastrophic crash, I survived the clinical betrayal of the man who gave me birth, and I built an independent empire entirely with my own integrity and resilience. If you are listening to this story right now, and you're the child whose silence and hard work have been treated as a disposable resource by the people who share your last name, hear me clearly. Your value is not defined by the absolute blindness or the predatory greed of a toxic household dynamic that refuses to see your worth. Strength does not mean enduring financial fraud, emotional neglect, or medical betrayal for the sake of a fake family peace that only serves the thieves in your life. True power is born the exact moment you stop begging for the validation of people who trade love for currency, and you begin to use your own brilliant mind to establish unbreakable walls around your future. My media victory was a flawless, airtight execution of pure public strategy that permanently shielded my grandmother's legacy from the hands of criminals. An image of a successful independent business owner looking out over a peaceful river illustrates this triumph, standing as a physical manifestation of a fully liberated life. But the true victory, the one that allowed me to look into the mirror every single morning with a peaceful, confident smile, was the freedom of knowing that I am more than enough. Home is not a geographic structure defined by a shared surname, a genetic code, or the toxic obligation to sacrifice your youth for people who treat your existence like a convenience. Home is where your boundaries are treated as absolute, where your hard work is genuinely honored, and above all else, home is where you are respected.